Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm Kate Wilson, the project manager for Asia in the OECD Centre for Responsible Business Conduct. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar to mark the launch of the registration period for the OECD training program on due diligence for responsible banking and capital markets in the Asia Pacific region. The training program we're launching the registration for today will begin on the 1st of October 2026 and run over 4 sessions in the month of October and into the first week of November. In today's webinar, we'll give you an idea of what to expect from the training program to help you decide if it's for you or perhaps it's of interest to someone in your organization or network. To start with, a brief overview of what the training is all about. It's based on the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises on responsible business conduct, and specifically the risk-based due diligence framework that's embedded in the guidelines. So the content will focus on how this framework can be applied to financial transactions and investments, including by exploring how the OECD's due diligence standards are reflected and integrated into key industry frameworks for the financial sector. The purpose of the program is to provide participants with an opportunity to deepen their understanding of the responsible business conduct due diligence framework, learn from regional peers and experts on their practices, challenges, and lessons learned when they've been implementing responsible business conduct due diligence, and to be inspired to strengthen and improve their own institutions' environmental and social risk management systems. The program itself is part of a 4-year project the OECD is implementing called the Responsible Business Conduct for Green, Digital and Resilient Supply Chains in Asia project. So this involves a whole range of different activities with different stakeholders and sectors, focused on increasing the uptake of responsible business conduct throughout supply chains in the region. So we've been working with partners in Australia, Japan, Korea, New Zealand, and Singapore in particular, as well as other parts of Southeast Asia over the last couple of years to increase the uptake of responsible business conduct. The project is funded by the European Union, so I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the EU's support for the upcoming training program. Today, I have with me Benjamin Michel, who is a due diligence and sustainable finance policy analyst in the Centre for Responsible Business Conduct. And Benjamin has been with the Centre for 6 years now and has been working closely with stakeholders in and around the financial sector during that time to prepare analysis and recommendations on how the OECD responsible business conduct standards can apply to the sector. Benjamin will be providing training participants with the core content of the program in October and November. And so today we've asked him to share some findings from a recent OECD case study on due diligence. It's called Due Diligence Essentials for Responsible Banking and Capital Markets, to give us an idea of some of the risks and challenges that we'll be talking about during the training. We also have Maki Shibatsuchi and Ashish Sharma with us to share their insights. Ms. Maki Shibatsuchi has over 10 years of experience in environmental and social risk assessment in the banking sector. And as head of the environmental and social assessment team at MUFG Bank, she currently leads the assessment of the bank's transactions across the Asia Pacific, as well as in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. And Mr. Ashish Sharma has more than 13 years experience in the sustainable finance and also assessing climate risk. As an executive director in the Chief Sustainability Office at DBS Bank, Ashish leads the group-wide environmental sustainability and net zero strategy and engages closely with regulators and industry bodies across the Asia Pacific region. So thank you all for joining us today. And I'll now pass to Benjamin to share the findings of the recent case study on due diligence in the financial sector.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kate. Yes, indeed. So the financial sector, including banks, institutions operating in financial markets, are responsible for allocating capital across the entire economy, therefore being exposed to a wide range of social, environmental, governance impacts and risk. This is really the backdrop and precisely why the OECD developed over the past decade a series of tools and guidance to help investors conduct responsible business due diligence across their lending, investment portfolios to better decide where to invest, how to invest, including with prospective clients, and to identify, prevent, and address impact tied to those lending and investment activities. As some of you may be familiar, we've developed over the last decade tools and guidance for institutional investors, for including asset owners and managers, for commercial banks in the context of corporate lending and investment banks and development banks as well for project and asset finance. More recently, and as Kate mentioned, also in the context of the 50th anniversary of the OECD guidelines, we've published a series of case studies to understand remaining challenges and opportunities faced by different actors in different sectors of the economy, including banking and capital markets. The case studies I'm going to present today is particularly relevant to introduce the training program because it really pinpoints to the remaining challenges and opportunities faced by the sector when they're implementing due diligence. Exactly, also in line with the program, it will draw on a decade of engagement that we've had in developing those guidance and standards, but also it will take stocks of the different challenges that we have identified while engaging with banks and financial institutions to try to understand how we can overcome some of those and how it can be more tailored to the Asia Pacific region. Indeed, also, since we started developing standards on due diligence in the financial sector, the landscape has changed a lot. Proliferation of industry standards, as Kate mentioned. Also, we've moved a bit from standards to policies, new risk, new geopolitical context. So we understand from our engagement that there is a need maybe to deep dive a bit more in some specificities of how to conduct due diligence and what it means for more resilient businesses, more resilient supply chains, especially in the region. Today, I'm going to focus a bit on three main aspects of the case studies. Why first, some features of the financial sector are really important and specific and what it means for doing due diligence. I'm also going to be looking at the most salient impact that the financial sector is facing. And finally, also, I'm going to focus on the remaining challenges and opportunities for doing due diligence, especially in the Asia Pacific region. So first, what are the distinctive features of the financial sector and what makes it maybe sometimes more practically challenging to do due diligence? To begin with, financial institutions are usually well placed to conduct due diligence because risk management sits at the core of their practices. Managing risk, it's what financial sector practitioners are doing on a daily basis. They have already built in the infrastructure for identifying risk, but usually it's really capture something fairly different, which is mostly addressing financial risk. Here in RBC due diligence, some of you may know, it's really addressing adverse impacts on people and planet. That being said, for us, we also understand the dynamic nature of doing those two risk assessments in parallel. There are really two distinctive features that we want to focus on today also is that what we acknowledge that when you're a financial institution, the breadth of your portfolio is challenging. Banks or investors holdings can mirror markets as a whole, meaning their potential due diligence scope is very broad, but it's also why prioritization in that context is key. Second, indirect linkage. Institutions are rarely like the cause of the impact that they're exposed to. Usually it's going to be clients who are going to be facing those impacts. So it raises practical questions on how you do due diligence, especially according to international standards, specifically around the notion of impact remediation, how to exercise leverage, and so on. So I'll come back to that later. So as I mentioned, also, I wanted to focus today on some of the core findings of which are the silent impacts that we identified that are faced by financial institutions today. It's also based on interviews and surveys that we've conducted with experts But what we identify for banking and capital markets, especially that first, as I mentioned before, because portfolios span the whole economy, banks and investors are virtually linked to every types of impact that can arise in the real economy. Therefore, risk and impact are inherently dependent on the asset class or the financing approach that financial institutions and banks are going to adopt. Taking, for example, project and asset finance transactions, particularly for projects with large footprint, large infrastructure, those will be more likely to be associated with land rights violations, displacements, forced relocation, especially where the project's going to sit near indigenous people's lands, communities affected, and so on. Some types of risk are more acute also, for instance, in the context of venture capital. This is a key source of financing for new technologies, unregulated markets, whose product promises innovation, but also sometimes comes with potential human rights violations. We can think of surveillance technologies, generative AI, we are sometimes key concerns for potential impacts on human rights. So it requires specific safeguards and specific due diligence tools to make sure that you are properly assessing those in your investments. Secondly, among the key impacts that we identified are all the impacts and risks which are not necessarily linked to the sectors, the products, or the activities that you're financing, but they are more inherently connected to the financial product or services themselves. As you may know, some financial institutions have been linked to adverse human rights impacts due to sometimes speculations on derivatives related to agricultural commodities. We've seen like food bubbles happening a few decades ago, which have impacted sometimes like the rights to food, to affordable foods, commodities, and related human rights for some communities. Likewise, some financial services have been linked to discrimination. We know sometimes that lending institutions may deny customers access to finance based on specific characteristics. Similarly, loans can be approved or denied based on algorithms, financial models that have the potential to perpetuate, exacerbate some discriminations. Moving on now to the remaining challenges that we've identified through the case studies. They're really for us the core of what we want also to tackle through the training program and what we want to build in the training program and focus on. I'm going to focus today on 6 recurring challenges that are still happening in the financial sector when they are trying to conduct due diligence. First, it's related to information deficit. Banks and investors may be engaging with thousands of clients or investing companies at once, making risk identification inherently difficult. The scale of the gap is worth noting, for instance, around like small amounts, around like, for example, 80,000 multinational companies worldwide. We expect like only 10,000 are actually reporting environmental and social performance indicators, which means that for investors, it's very difficult to access precise information on risk and impacts in potential investing companies. Second, and related to that, is prioritization. For large, diverse portfolio, the universe of potential adverse impacts can be very vast, and portfolio are also dynamic, shifting, you acquire and divest all the time on a daily basis. So this moving target dimension is very already like creating complexities when you want to prioritize your engagement, especially for stewardship activity. Third one is how to engage with stakeholders. Direct engagement with stakeholders and especially impacted rights holders, it's not necessarily standard practice for many banks and investors. Usually they typically limit their engagements to direct clients, to beneficiaries. Also on top of that, client confidentiality, some potential risk of interfering in the management systems and corporate governance of some of their investing companies can also create some barriers to stakeholder engagement. But that's also what's sometimes limiting access to meaningful information. I want also to focus on leverage limitations. There are different types of leverage limitations that can happen, especially, for instance, in the context of minority shareholding. We've been engaging with a lot of investors, large institutional investors sometimes as well, who say that they can't influence the companies that are investing in, including in the context of adverse impact arising from their activities, because they're a minority shareholder. Second, also the asset class can be a limit to influence. Bondholder, especially in the context of sovereign bond holding, is making investor very challenging to influence the behavior of their investees. Passive investment as well. We know passive strategies, passive investment strategies, including with ETF markets, being automated, making hard to understand exactly how you can influence companies if you're only passively investing. So that's also something that we want to address. Fourth, and that's specifically for banks, the timing sometimes can be challenging because once you've disbursed all of the funds, leverage usually drops at the moment. So how can you influence your clients in a context where you've already given the funds and there is more limited or more challenging and practical actions that you can adopt to influence your clients. And five, also what's interesting is it's also the context of competitive pressure. We know that the financial markets, banks, they're operating in a very highly competitive sector. And sometimes due diligence requirement can become very strict and competitors can have space to negotiate some of the terms and conditions and so on. And in many aspects, environmental and social consideration, in that case, they can maybe slip away and not being taken so seriously. Related to that, I think something that more broadly that is the limitations to doing due diligence in the financial sector is really antitrust and competition considerations. We know that some of the stewardship tools, investor coalition, especially in the client space, have sometimes been questioned or even like attacked on a legal basis because they raise concerns in terms of competition issue and antitrust. So that's also something that regulators and policymakers have a role to play in clarifying what's permissible under antitrust rules. Finally, I think something that's interesting in the financial sector as well is how to balance transparency and confidentiality, client confidentiality. Client confidentiality is really fundamental to the banking and capital markets. A duty of confidentiality extends well beyond financial information, sometimes even to the very existence of the client relationship itself. That being said, the case study is trying to provide very practical answers, how you can work with your clients to waive this client confidentiality for the purpose of disclosing practically adverse impacts on people and planet. Let's now move on to the opportunities. I think what's really important to emphasize for this case studies is that the financial sector, as I mentioned, has long conducted financial and legal due diligence to assess the creditworthiness, the financial health, operational viability of its clients. So the culture of identifying risk and impacts is not appearing from thin air. It's already built from decades of regulations and market practice. It's a huge opportunity that we can build on to really embed RBC, responsible business due diligence, in the financial sector. The shift underway is one of scope, really. It's really moving on from only looking at ESG factors as financial risk, but also looking at those factors as also adverse impacts and opportunities that you can contribute to. Some also opportunities in the financial sector is really like the boom of the sustainable finance landscape. ESG label assets are on track to exceed $40 trillion by 2030. It's really expanding fast. Number of tools are being provided, including ESG ratings tools, AI tools also to support funds in identifying risk and impacts, and so on. So there are really many opportunities for you to really scale those due diligence processes. It's also particularly relevant for the Asia Pacific region, being at the center of global supply chains. This is also like a region where sustainable finance regulations are quite advancing fast. We've been witnessing in the EU a lot of financial sustainable finance regulations happening in the last 5 years, but now it's also in Asia that's we're turning an eye on, where we see a number of policy developments happening very fast. So this is really based on this landscape that the training program is designed to really provide practical advice to financial institutions in the Asia Pacific on how to really scale those practices, really understanding the synergies between different standards that they're really already familiar with, understand the connections between RBC due diligence as explained in the OECD guidelines, and what it means also for them when they're maybe wanting to align with ISSB, TCFD, TNFD, all of these frameworks that you may be familiar with. Of course, also the AFC performance standards for project and asset finance. So we really want to build on what's out there and not create something, not reinvent the wheel. And we're really looking forward to working with you in the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. So considering some of the challenges that Ben has mentioned there, I'm going to now ask Maki and Ashish to share. So Maki first, what are some of the challenges that MUFG Bank faces implementing due diligence, and how are you addressing them?
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Ben, for the introduction. Very good segue into the question on this item. So MFG, we're an active participant in global project finance market, providing financing for a broad range of development projects from power generation to infrastructure. So responding to questions, drawing our experience in project finance, I'd like to highlight some of the key due diligence challenges we encounter in practice. So given the potentially significant environmental social impacts associated with large-scale developments, robust due diligence and risk management are essential in our mindsets. During the course of due diligence, one of the biggest challenges we face is identifying the correct environmental social risks for each project and determining how they should be addressed. As you can imagine, the key issues can vary depending on the sector, location. For example, land acquisition displacements are often major concerns in mining, hydro projects, while biodiversity impacts may be particularly important for instance, infrastructure like ports or roads developments. However, as financiers and not being the project operators, we may be distant from the risks and impacts, which makes it difficult to locate what's actually happening on ground. The scope of environmental social consideration is also expanding. Beyond traditional project level impacts, we increasingly need to assess issues such as human rights, supply chain risks, activities in conflict affected or high-risk areas, you name it. Another challenge is that, particularly during the early stage of project development, which we increasingly see, we face situations where environmental social assessments or management plans are not always fully developed. As lenders, we often need to determine what additional assessments or mitigations we need to determine, even when information is very limited. To address these challenges, we try to apply a risk-based approach grounded in international frameworks, such as the credit principles or others, when financing large-scale developments. Based on this assessment, where material environmental social risks, gaps, or management weaknesses are identified, we may require the borrower to implement corrective actions or incorporate specific requirements into financial conditions to ensure that the measures in place will continue. And after financial close and during the monitoring phase, we continue following up with the project to confirm that the borrower is meeting its commitments and implementing agreed mitigation measures. Most importantly, in due diligence, we do not view the environmental social assessment simply as a checkbox or compliance exercise. Rather, we see it as an ongoing process of engagement with project sponsors or stakeholders to drive continuous improvement. And through this process, we believe that environmental social due diligence can enhance project performance and ultimately contribute to more sustainable development outcomes. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Maki. And turning to you, Ashish, some of the challenges that you're facing at DBS Bank and when it comes to responsible business conduct.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you for the introduction. I'll try and keep this very short, and I'll cover a little bit both linked to the work we do at DBS and even in my past life. So I think a few things. Number one, the most important thing for us as financial institutions is to understand our role in the entire process. So we're linked, but we're not in control, but that doesn't mean we don't do anything. So that single fact means that our instrument is leverage, not control. Exit should be our last resort, not the first move. So I think that's the most important takeaway that I will leave people with. In terms of risks, I think if you look across Asia Pacific, the impacts in our footprint are real and severe. They aren't abstract anymore, right? The human cost of the energy transition in coal dependent economies, whether it is deforestation or land rights in palm oil and pulp across Indonesia and Malaysia, all these risks are real. And historically, we've been asked to think of financial materiality. However, thinking of severity to people is a genuine reset and the right one, and something we all should be focusing on as we go ahead. I think there's no brownie points for me saying that data and traceability are important or binding constraints. A lot of our lending sometimes is general corporate lending, unlike project financing, where you could ring fence an asset, add covenants into the agreements, etc., etc. But with general lending and standard loan templates, some of these become even more challenging. And then finally, I think the balance between civil society expectations, taxonomy, regulations, making sure we support a just transition. And when I say transition, this is not just about the green economy, it's also about being more resilient in the face of both environmental and social risks. So I think balancing all of that is very, very challenging. Finally, how do we address all of this, or what have we been doing? I think the most important point I would say is that bold due diligence considerations as part of your credit process. Don't make it an add-on, make it part of your credit process. Engage early, time bound some of the engagement, build leverage alone, collectively, consortium where possible, where not possible, and ensure responsibility and understanding is clear with the clients as well that you bank with. So those are some of the key challenges and the ways we've gone about it.
Thank you. And then looking forward, what are some of the areas where organizations such as DBS need more support or more effort, and what would you like to gain from the OECD training program?
I think the key point, which even Benjamin covered a while back, is the case studies bit. How do we use Asian case studies, give everyone involved in this process, whether it's credit officers, relationship managers, risk teams who make actual calls, and this is not the sustainability function, make them use a shared language? How do we spread that message wider? So that's one important thing. Second, as the training goes through, and with the increasing expectations that a lot of banks have on from regulators, from civil societies, from exchanges, whether it's TCFT, TNFT, so on and so forth, how do we blend and make everyone understand that some of these requirements are common? So how do we make that language common? How do we say that doing some of this due diligence helps broader requirements that our stakeholders, our shareholders have of us? So it helps meet a lot more check boxes than you think it does. So that's the broader perspective that training can bring about significantly as well. The final thing I would say is, which is more practical, while I know OECD tends to not think of the global south, but I don't think that's true. The common perception could be that the global south is left out of this. But the view is emerging markets are a key part of the value chain. This cannot happen without Asia. It cannot happen without Asia Pacific. So the more we learn to embed some of these considerations into the way we look at our portfolios, our clients, the better it will be. So the training can cover some of that in terms of the engagement model, the transition model, the integrity model, and what guardrails to use. I think that would be a very important aspect that the training can cover as well.
Great, thank you. And then Maki, over to you on where you think there should be more effort and support, and what you would like to see more of through the training.
Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, we see environmental social due diligence as a way to improve the performance project that we finance. And to make this approach more effective, I believe there are two areas where additional support could be particularly valuable in the financial sector. One is practical knowledge sharing across the stakeholders, and a second is more implementation-focused guidance on risk-based due diligence. And I guess on project finance, I see that attention increasingly extending beyond impact within the specific locations to itself to risks across a broader value chain. For example, in renewable energy projects, there are growing concerns around the supply chains, critical minerals. In agriculture and biofuel projects, issues related to palm oil or soil supply chains, labor conditions, human rights, those arise. However, again, as financial institutions are not project operators, we are in a unique position and often indirect from adverse impacts, which has come up in the earlier discussion. And in most cases, we rely on limited information which has been made available. Therefore, we have only direct visibility into these risks. As a result, I think there's still important questions about how concepts such as the OECD responsible business conduct and human rights due diligence should be applied in the context of the traditional institutions such as for project finance. And personally, I find the OECD's guidance informative when describing the expectations placed on companies and financial institutions with respect to due diligence. And with that said, I would welcome further discussion and practical examples in the training on how these principles can be translated into project finance transactions and what level of leverage and financial institutions are realistically expected to exercise when addressing these identified risks. Another area that I mentioned is that we valued is guidance on how to implement risk-based approach in practice. And I guess, most financial institutions agree with this principle on working on a risk-based approach. But the challenge is, I think, determining how to apply it into practice. And as the environmental topics continue to expand into new areas, such as conducting due diligence on digitalization in our sector, the discussion looming, it can be difficult to determine which issues deserve the greatest attention. So in my view, practical sector-specific examples, which can be shared during training and has been shared by Benjamin in the introduction, would be extremely valuable during the training, which can be really serve as a guide for any financial sector institutions working further on due diligence. Thank you.
Thanks. Over to you, Ben. Briefly.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think echoing what Ashish and Maki had just said, I think the goal of the training will be to be very practical. And also, as you mentioned, we the different guidance that we developed over the years, they're by design, they're really providing the concepts, the high level expectations. I think really the goal of the training will be to deep dive and to provide very practical hands-on insights, building on case studies. We also want to rely, of course, on practitioners to really understand what are the challenges again, and also but to understand also the solutions. The goal also of the training is to build on solutions and what's been working. We also want to understand what's been working specifically in Asia Pacific. Clearly, the OECD standards are global standards, so we also want to make sure that the training is suited for specificities in the context of the region.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you to the three of you for bringing a really clear spotlight, I think, on exactly the sorts of challenges that we are going to try and address. And now the challenge has been set for us to meet the expectations that we've heard about today. I'll just ask colleagues to pop up the information about how to register. So registration is now open for the training program. It involves filling in a short online form that just takes a few minutes to complete. And the training consists of 4 sessions. So you can see up on the screen, each of these covers different steps in the due diligence framework. And so they each run for around 90 to 100 minutes each, and they each begin at 8 a.m. Central European time on the dates listed. So that will vary around the region. The program is free, so there's no cost to participants, and the main content for each session can be listened to in English, Korean, or Japanese. They're designed to be practical and interactive, is the format of how they'll run. And as Benjamin mentioned, a lot of case studies, a lot of practical examples to try and give some ideas to the participants. So a participant in the training program can attend all the sessions or only those that are most relevant to their organization, but those that attend at least 3 are eligible for a certificate of completion. And you can see that the material on the due diligence steps of 2 and 3 will be delivered twice. One session focused on the way that banks would implement these steps, and the other on how investors would. So participants could attend both of those if they wish, but we would recommend choosing the one that aligns most with the functions of your organization. So thank you all very much for listening, and thank you very much to our speakers, Maki, Ashish, and Benjamin, for joining us today. We hope this has given you a good sense of what we're talking about when it comes to this training opportunity. We're looking forward to seeing many of you listening today during the program. There's the details back up on the screen now, and there's information on the website. So don't hesitate to contact the OECD team using that email address if you have any questions about the program and how it will work. So that concludes everything that we wanted to share today. Thank you for joining, and enjoy the rest of your evening or the rest of your day. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.